On today's show, the Mac Pro with Apple Silicon in the last quarter of this year, 14-inch M2 MacBook Pros to replace the 13-inch model, my Twitter chat with Vadim from Max Tech, TSMC's price rise and what it will mean for the next iPhone, next generation Pro chips this year, AirPods Max 2, what to expect, external display expectations, and why the iPad Pro FaceID is just better. I'm MacBook Pro, I simplify Apple so that everything just works for you, and if you want the latest Apple news, leaks and rumours every weekday at 1300 UTC, like the video, subscribe to my channel, and ring my bell. So yes, DylanDKT has tweeted that Apple Silicon's transition will wrap up with the Mac Pro. Okay, I don't think that's too much of a shock to anyone, but Dylan also mentions that the Apple Silicon Mac Pro is going to be using an evolution of the M1 platform and not M2. That makes complete sense to me, even though I believe that M2 will be out in the spring. More on that in a little bit, but there's nothing to say that Apple wouldn't pursue a higher performance chip with older names. There's been a lot of pushback when I've suggested that this Mac Pro should have the fastest single core performance, given the price, but that wouldn't line up with what Apple did under Intel. The single core performance in almost all of the Xeon Mac Pros is beaten by a couple of iMacs and even the 2020 13-inch MacBook Pro with Intel inside. Not to mention every Apple Silicon Mac that's ever been released. The types of tasks that these machines are asked to provide are typically more reliant on multi-threaded workloads, and with up to 40 CPU cores and 128 GPU cores, that is all stuff that these can handily take care of. My expectation is that we will still see the Mac Pro at WWDC in June, but with it shipping later in the year, as I've said in the past. Dylan has also mentioned that Apple will replace the 13-inch MacBook Pro with a 14-inch display version, which I've also suggested in previous months. There seems to be some confusion as to why, but I think it makes total sense. Let's be honest, there wasn't enough differentiation between the M1 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro that it will be replaced by this new device. They had the same connectivity, the same display. I mean, closest makes no difference, one was a little bit brighter. The same webcam, the same keyboard, and the same trackpad. As well as the same chip inside, obviously. The MacBook Pro did get a touch bar, slightly longer battery and noisier cooling system though. Enter the M2 and the 14-inch chassis however, and it will have a bigger, much better display, a better webcam, better connectivity, and most likely even better battery in that new design. I think it could be $200 more starting at $14.99, and that seems pretty legit to me. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And in terms of when stuff is coming, I had a really fun discussion with Vadim from Max Tech yesterday on Twitter. I mentioned that I'm hoping for the M2 MacBook Pro in the spring and the M2 Pro and Max chips in the autumn. He's thinking M2 is not coming until the fall and the M2 Pro and Max not until 2023, and then maybe not even until the fall. Given that we've had the past two iterations of the iPad Pro in the spring of 2020 and 2021 though, I think that the M2 is likely to be here by the spring. But Vadim makes a really good point about how crowded the spring event is looking, saying it's hard to believe that they'll actually release a high-end Mac Mini, high-end iMac, M2, MacBook Air and MacBook Pro at the same event in the spring as the iPad Air and the iPhone SE with 5G. The SE and the iPad, to me, could quite easily both be press releases, no new designs and just kind of picking up second-hand features from other devices, no real innovations here. But they're both broader appeal products than probably most of the new Macs will be for most people, and any iPhone release will bring more attention to the event in general. But in terms of how the event could share both of the chips, the M1 Pro and M1 Max already exist, so it's just a case of revealing those new form factors for the iMac Big and the Mac Mini More Powerful. I believe those are both the official marketing names. But then Apple can release the M2 in a MacBook Pro, a MacBook Air and a Mac Mini, comparing the M1 with the M2 Max by pushing the battery life improvements. That gives Apple a really great way to compare and contrast, showing why people would want the M2 and who the M1 Pro and Max are for. Then just before Tim introduces one more thing, out of the darkness appears another iMac, this time in jet black, which is obviously better than space grey, and inside the first dual M1 Max chip. 20 cores of CPU, 64 cores of GPU, maybe 32-inch display, but more likely 27 inches. Nice. And that would make sense to bring out alongside the iPad Pros with M1, and then you get the whole kind of gamut coming through. That makes sense to me. Let me know in the comments if you think that is too much for one event. Right, into your iCave answers. If you want to get a question answered, hashtag iCave answers in the comments section. First one comes from James Apple. Do you buy this iPhone 14 Pro series of smartphones having a USB-C cable because of regulation from the EU and now the US, and now TSMC will be raising prices on the A16 chipset? So I did a bit of maths on this chipset thing. I don't think that the USB-C is coming to the iPhones, even with the legislation coming from Europe and the US. It just means you can't use something other than that, but you can use MagSafe because it's not a port. So I think that's most likely to be the way that they will go when they actually get enforced. However, in terms of the price increases at TSMC, now TSMC only does like the cutting edge chips. They don't make the boards in general, as far as I'm aware. And the best estimate that I could get was that an A12 in the XS Max, when that was built, when that was originally brought out, cost about $75. Now, assuming that we take that as our price for the chip, a 5% price increase, which is what's being talked about for Apple, is around $3.75. And then the company, Apple themselves, tend to run at a gross margin of around 39 to 40%, which means that when you multiply it out, the price increase to maintain their margin on the iPhones would be $6.15. Now, I'd say that this is the kind of cost that can be absorbed by fluctuations in other parts. For example, the display assembly is used for a number of years. The price of that technology probably doesn't increase unless the technology itself improves, or the cost of static amounts of storage, or the camera sensor, or things like that. So will the TSMC price rises mean more expensive iPhones? No, but Apple could use it as justification if they also add costs in other areas, like the rumoured 48 megapixel cameras. So what I'm saying is, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a price rise, but if there is, it ain't down to that chip price increase. Next up, Randomness R asks, iCave answers, will we get the M2 Pro and M2 Max MacBooks this year in Q4? Well, that's certainly my opinion, as you will have heard at the beginning of the show. No reason to go any further into detail on that one. Just rewind. Randomness R asks, iCave answers, what are Apple's plans for the AirPods Max 2? I absolutely love my pair of AirPods Max. I didn't at first, but they really grow on you. And as I've said in the past, I think that all of Apple's headphones products, the AirPods, the AirPods Pro and the AirPods Max, are all going to be on a 3-year upgrade cycle at the moment. We got the AirPods Max at the end of 2020. Then we got AirPods 3rd generation at the end of last year. And I think we're getting AirPods Pro at the end of this year. That seems to be what the rumours are saying. So that would stand to reason then that the AirPods Max would get their refresh the following year in 2023. In terms of what they're going to do with it, I think the best thing we can do is look at what they do with the AirPods Pro first. Assume that technology will move on. It looks like ultra-wideband might be involved, which would allow lossless streaming and a few other features. So that's an interesting point. That's quite possible, but there's not a great deal to go on at this point. Whether they'll get a full redesign, I don't really know. I wouldn't have thought they will because they look pretty awesome. It might be that they need to have some kind of different panels on there in order to let the wireless signals through for ultra-wideband, but I'm not a systems engineer in that way, and I don't really know. The only other thing that I think they could get is 5G and the ability to use one of those Siri voice-only plans in order to access your music directly on the headphones without needing a phone with you. Randomness R asks, iCave answers, what kind of external displays can we expect from Apple, and when are they coming? Spring or fall? Thanks, mate. So I really don't know on this one. This is one that could actually just be when we get to WWDC and they talk about the Mac Pro. That's a possibility. It could not come out until the end of the year, potentially in December, at the same time as the Mac Pro. Or it could be that they actually just drop with the new Mac Minis, potentially. It depends on where they're pricing these, what kind of market they're going for. I think we are going to have still a Pro Display XDR level display, and then I think the other two are going to be based on what you get from an iMac, exactly the same panels, in a different housing. And I think they could come in the spring if Apple intends it. And Team Kinetics asks, Kev answers, why can my iPad Pro recognise my face for Face ID in portrait and landscape orientation, but the iPhone can only recognise my face in portrait orientation? This seems like it could be a relatively simple software fix, or does the iPad Pro have bigger and more complicated Face ID sensor arrays? Now, I've been looking online to try and find this out. I think it does have a wider spread dot projector. Obviously, it was designed to be able to work in both orientations. I wonder if the camera that receives those dots is kind of a square sensor rather than being landscape or portrait as you would have with most cameras. So I think that might be part of it. It could even be a round sensor. Who knows? But yes, it's just that Apple did intend this in the first place to be able to be used in any direction. That was right from day one of the iPad. That was part of its remit. Whereas with iPhone, iPhone has definitely got an up and a down. You can put it across into landscape orientation. Most people would be doing that if they're doing things like Zoom meetings quite a lot, and you might have it on a tripod. That's where it would become useful to me, I would say. But to most people, I'm just not sure if it's something that Apple needs to fix. I know it's slightly inconvenient sometimes, but how much is it getting in the way of your day? Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for our Patreons over here, and Cupertino's looking nice. Check out the merch. Thanks very much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.